The presentation of anarchism as social philosophy which aims at the emancipation, economic, social, political, and spiritual of the human race. The emancipation.
Anarchist Essays is brought to you by Loughborough University's Anarchism Research Group. For more information on the ARG, see the link in the show notes or follow us on Twitter at ARGLBORO.
The article Updating Anarchism, the Transnational Debate on Anarchist Ideology and Tactics in the Aftermath of the First World War, looks at a specific transnational debate about the need, or not, to revise tactics or even aspects of anarchist ideology. This debate took place at a pivotal moment in anarchist history as anarchists sought to analyse and seek solutions to certain deficiencies in practical as well as ideological areas that had become evident over the course of the anarchist involvement in the Russian Revolution and the post-World War I revolutionary wave of 1917 to 1923. The debate was part of a general attempt by anarchists to come to terms with a drastically changed world, socially, politically and economically, that threatened to leave them behind. Traditionally, the interwar period has been seen as the end of anarchism as a mass movement. Now, clearly anarchists did not see things this way. Despite the clear setbacks of the post-war period, anarchists had just shown a level of revolutionary action unprecedented in the movement's history. As important as the failure in revolutionary movements across Europe was the fact that these situations had actually occurred, and this made it seem reasonable for the anarchists to have the thesis that the dictatorships in countries such as Spain, Italy and even Russia were the final desperate phase in the collapse of capitalism, Bolshevism being seen as state capitalism by anarchists. Anarchists therefore needed to pick themselves up, dust themselves down and prepare for the next inevitable revolutionary period. Now, the central arguments of the revisionist debate originated and formulated in the anarchist press in the aftermath of Mussolini's rise to power. The discussions initially focused mainly on issues related to the Italian anarchist movement. However, from 1924, with the intervention of Enrico Malatesta, the debate attracted the interest of anarchists from various countries on both sides of the Atlantic. As I said, the debate began in the Italian press, so we need a little context to understand why. The period after the war, known as the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, witnessed a massive growth in social protests, peasants taking the land, strikes and factory occupations by the workers, which left many on the left believing that they were on the brink of a revolution. However, once the factory occupations of September 1920 ended, through negotiation between government and socialist-dominated unions, the revolutionary movement effectively ended, and the repression of the Italian anarchists began. A number of anarchist newspapers were closed down, hundreds of anarchists were arrested or forced to go into exile. The original debate about revisionism then began in October 1922, in the aftermath of Mussolini's ascent to power at the end of that month. This was the trigger for the experienced anarchist journalist Luigi Damiani to call for the Italian anarchists to be audacious and to undertake a form of revision of everything that was said 60 years ago when life was less complex, the beginning of the movement in Italy. This was in order to reanimate the movement. He claimed there needed to be a clarification of ideals to make them understandable and up to date. The initial debate was carried out in the pages of a newspaper called Pagine Libertari, but this was forced to close in 1923, and this initial debate that there had been in the page of this paper achieved little. It kind of focused on the ideas such as organisation and violence, already the subject of debate for some time in the anarchist movement, but without really going beyond stating that these were the areas that needed to be developed. The one standout contribution came from the young Camilla Berneri, who argued that the Italian anarchists were lacking political consciousness in the sense that we are not aware of the contemporary problems and we continue to present diluted solutions taken from our past literature. These needed to be brought up to date. He wanted an idealistic and at the same time realistic anarchism that grasps the new truth to its old fundamental truth. Among the ideas he claimed needed to be updated was the position towards the role of the state anarchists seemed to reduce this to a political organism, an instrument for maintaining social inequality. But it was also an administrative organism that could be transformed. It could be taken apart and reassembled along the federal lines, but it could not be denied. To destroy it would stop the rhythm of the nation's life that beats in the arteries of the railways, etc., etc., he claimed. Therefore, whereas the creation of party consciousness developed over a clear programme put forward by Maneri was in line with much that had been said in previous congresses of the anarchist union in Italy that had been created in 1919, the reappraisal of the nature of the state and its potential values was a proposal for a profound revision of what many at the time perceived as the anarchist position on this, although the debate had been open before, and it's a position that Malatesta would also develop. Now, Malatesta began to get involved at the beginning of 1924 when a new anarchist newspaper, Pensiero e Volontà, began publication in Rome. What Malatesta wanted to do was to study the reasons that caused our failure, anarchist failure, during the revolution period, in order to be better prepared to act with better results when new circumstances call us into practical action. Anarchists needed to look at what their mistakes were, their deficiencies, and what our responsibility, or the anarchist responsibility, was in the defeat. Summarising his ideas, because there were many articles, Malatesta claimed that anarchists were too weak to bring about the revolution themselves in terms of numbers. The masses, he also went on, and even some anarchists, did not understand exactly what they stood for, and therefore they needed more time and a political situation which allowed them to organise, to draw up a clear political programme, and to be able to propagate anarchist ideas and beliefs and educate the masses. Their message needed to be clearer, more developed and credible, and this included accepting that certain aspects of the existing state apparatus would need to be maintained, at least in the short term. So rather than a revision of overall beliefs, Malatesta was proposing one of tactics in the immediate and medium term in order to be able to create a system based on these beliefs. And in what I see as an article that almost concludes all these ideas, called Gradualism, that was produced in 1925, he argues, we must by necessity be gradualist. We should content ourselves with gradual progress while the moral level of the people grows, and with it the material and intellectual means available to mankind, and while clearly doing all we can through study, work and propaganda to hasten development towards ever higher ideals. So the basic idea is they're going to need time to educate the people. They need to work with other political organisations on the left, and that revolution was not one stage but a multi-stage, 2, maybe 3 process. Now, his articles were reprinted in many countries and inspired anarchists from Spain, France, the USA, Cuba, Argentina and Uruguay to respond directly to his ideas, and then in turn to the ideas of the others who were commenting on those ideas. The countries where the debate got most traction were Spain, France and Argentina. The main variant to the position put forward by Malatesta was that developed in Spain by Antonio Garcia in the Barcelona-based journal Revista Nueva, whose arguments drew comments not only in Spain but also in the anarchist press in the United States, Cuba, Argentina and Uruguay, like Malatesta. Garcia Belan's main point was that anarchism was failing because it had not kept up to date with scientific advances. It was, as I said, stagnated and out of date. By science, it must be assumed from his articles that Garcia Belan meant psychology, but unfortunately he was never very clear. Whether this was to do with the censorship that existed at the time is not clear, but his ideas were very kind of abstract. But summarising, his main argument was that the anarchist belief in the innate goodness of mankind and the natural solidarity that they had been proven to be mistaken, and therefore his understanding of the masses were wrong. The understanding of the individual and his or her motivations had changed, and with that those of the masses in general. Anarchist blind faith in the masses and their potential to create a revolution along anarchist lines therefore needed to be revised if anarchists hoped to stop following the paths that lead nowhere. So if by nature the masses were not revolutionary, then somebody had to make them so. Piece of education. While during any revolutionary process somebody needed to guide them towards the anarchist goals. Obviously the impact here of the Bolshevik Revolution is very important. Also in Spain, Ángel Pestaña, the former national secretary of the anarcho-syndicalist trade union, the CNT, used the revision debate to put forward his idea on the need for an independent national organisation in Spain, for the anarchists to organise themselves specifically as anarchists. Up to this point, when Spanish anarchists spoke about their organisation, they meant the CNT, the unions. So Pestaña argued that a national organisation would allow anarchists to debate their positions, specifically, and more importantly towards the labour movement, outside of the unions, and thus avoiding or lessening the divisions and the internal bickering that had caused the CNT so many problems in the post-war period. Therefore, his interest in the transnational debate was more about what was happening in Spain. He simply used it to get some prominence. In Argentina, La Protesta, the leading anarchist paper and an official paper of the trade union Fora, dominated the anarchist press of the country, both financially and in terms of popularity. La Protesta saw itself as a defender of Argentine anarchism and endeavoured to dominate and control all anarchist propaganda. Its efforts to dominate anarchist propaganda were unsurprisingly opposed by other sectors, and especially at that time the group behind the newspaper El Libertario, which was run by a syndicalist-leaning faction of the anarchist movement, who had created their own national organisation for anarchists, the Alianza Libertaria Argentina, in 1923. La Protesta wanted to purge the movement of these elements, which they argued were not really anarchists. They were, in their words, chameleons who were under the sway of the Bolsheviks. The early 1920s in Argentina saw the decline of the influence of the anarchists of the Fora and a growing internal conflict in the highly and polarised Argentine anarchist movement, and this was the background to the debates on revisionism. Quite simply, La Protesta opposed all revision. For them, the real revisionists were these anarcho-Bolsheviks who were trying to introduce changes to the consecrated concepts of anarchy under the guise of revolutionary expedients, in an attempt to justify a Bolshevik boss bent on seizing power and control over the working class. Therefore, for La Protesta, rather than revision, what was needed was simply to remove the Bolshevik elements from the Fora trade union, from the anarchist movement, and that way it would be sanitized. The anarchists of El Libertario and the ALA did not get directly involved in the revisions debate. They were, in effect, already carrying out their own revision. But La Protesta's high-handed rejection of revisionism did provoke the ear and anger of the anarchist newspaper Brazo y Cerebro, which criticised the La Protesta for being anarchist rectors. For the newspaper, in a number of articles, anarchists had to understand why they had failed during the revolutionary period, why the masses seemed to have conformed, and whether this had anything to do with anarchist methods and tactics. They needed to learn from the past, and a revision of actions and events would allow this. Despite these declarations, and something that was very similar throughout the entire debate, the newspaper did not propose any real solutions, simply mentioning the problems. Meanwhile, over in France, Julien Contant, the anarchist, argued that the anarchist movement in France was passing through what he called an apathetic period. With social democratic reformism being triumphant among the working class, it was therefore necessary for anarchists to go through a period of reflection and try and work out why the socialists were so popular and they weren't. He believed that anarchists were living in a kingdom of delusions, they were not facing reality, and that the revolution was not coming today, tomorrow, or any day soon, because before any social or political revolution was possible, what was needed was a revolution of the mind. Anarchists should focus on the evolution of society toward the acceptance of anarchist ideals. This evolution was central to any anarchist revolution. As this was more a general or gradual process, Contant argued that anarchists could not simply boycott general elections, and actually supported voting for the Cartel de Gauche in the 1924 French elections, as they promised to release incarcerated political prisoners, which included many anarchists. Anarchist Contant continued needed to adapt our means to the moment or situation. So then, rather than dogma, pragmatism was the guide. Now, perhaps this went further than Malatesta proposed. Malatesta did not name the progressive forces that would bring about the first stage of his revolutionary theory, the idea that you'd have to work with other groups on the left. Although sure, he must have been thinking about radical socialists. But working alongside to achieve revolutionary goals did not necessarily mean working with or voting for. Nonetheless, the French revisionists, of which Conton was the leader, were trying to put the abstract into practice. Le Libertaire, the newspaper of the Union Anarchiste Française, rejected out of hand the justification for voting in the 1924 elections. For them, in an editorial, anarchism was a doctrine based on clear principles which could not be sacrificed in the name of utility. The general position of French anarchists towards Malateste's position, reflected in Le Libertaire, accepted that tactics needed to be updated. Anarchism needed to adapt to the present and to be able to embrace it. What was required was a new method of action, not a revision. And anarchists had to know how to adapt their action to the circumstances. Again, there was great sympathy or interest with Malateste's ideas, but overall articles on revisionism in the newspaper mainly put forward vague suggestions, but not definite solutions to the issues. Now, I'm coming to the end, so I'm going to kind of try and get a kind of general conclusion about what was quite a complex group of arguments. The debate showed a movement struggling to adapt to the new realities whilst trying not to lose its identity. The main points raised were not new. Questions of organisation, a clear programme of action, the role of education and revolutionary tactics had all been discussed before, but obviously not in the light of actually trying to put them into practice as had occurred in the post-war period. Malateste's reappraisal of revolutionary policy was heavily influenced by his own experience in Italy, but the general thrust of his argument was accepted by the majority of anarchists involved in the debate, irrespective of which country they came from. Beyond national idiosyncrasies, there was a clear general agreement on the need to reappraise, if not revise, there was a big argument over the terminology, but to revise or reappraise tactics in the light of contemporary realities in order to bring anarchism up to date, and acceptance that certain aspects most definitely needed to be changed. There was general agreement on the need for better organisation, the anarchist norms of which still needed to be worked out. The need for a clear programme to present to the masses, a clear means of educating them to understand the programme and how to put it into practice, and the need for a more gradual approach with the concomitant logic of relations with states and even political groups that facilitated the advance of these goals, important obviously in relation to the democracies that were forming or consolidating post-World War I. Yet if the debates about Malateste's ideas would have any long-term impact, these ideas did need to be developed, practical flesh put onto the theoretical bones. How should anarchists organise? And how could they do so in a way that was effective without breaking anarchist principles of individual responsibility? And how could they draw up a programme of action that they would all agree to, and ensure that members of their organisation would follow it? Who were the forces that would help bring about the first stage or stage of the revolution? And how exactly should anarchists help them? These questions, and indeed their answers, would raise a further series of queries about related issues, such as educational policy, propaganda, the role of violence, and how they would organise the means to ensure the production and distribution were maintained during any revolutionary transition. So, patience, organisation and a clear programme were simply the necessary starting points for the development of the gradual evolution towards anarchy. To summarise, the debate went little beyond suggesting areas to revise rather than how to practically do this, and this in itself shows the mountain that anarchism needed to climb to be relevant in the new post-war reality.
Thank you for listening. To help others find anarchist essays, please rate and review us wherever you find your podcasts. And if you're interested in anarchist ideas, why not check out the journal Anarchist Studies? For over 20 years, Anarchist Studies has been publishing original research on the history, theory, and practice of anarchism. For more information, visit www.lwbooks.co.uk/anarchist-studies.